Welcome back to MLL 400, the literature of travel in the 20th century. Where had we left off? We had, of course, accompanied Langston Hughes on his travels to the Soviet Union. And he had even taken us on a little stint to Japan and China. And you might remember, of course, that was in the supplementary readings, right? But we had read that very short passage about Shanghai and how warmly the people of Shanghai had welcomed him and how he met with a number of Chinese intellectuals, but also how he observed in Shanghai, in the international settlement, the same kind of racism that he knew from back home in the United States, which probably then had inspired him to write a poem, right? That poem, Raw China, that we had read, and that also was in dialogue with that play by Tretyakov, right? By that Soviet playwright, which he had seen in New York in 1930, that woodblock print, right? That was inspired by the play or maybe by the poem. And I wanted to just look at a few lines from that poem again real quick. So he writes, so they came with gunboats, set up concessions, zones of influence, international settlements, missionary houses, banks, and Jim Crow YMCAs. They beat you with Malacca canes and dared you to raise your head, except to cut it off. So the they here, of course, refers to European imperialists and also increasingly Japanese, right? We had talked about how European powers, especially Britain, started to slice up China in the wake of the Opium Wars, right? We talked about that during our first module when we read Huang Zunxian. And we talked again about European imperialism in Asia when we read Hermann Hesse. And of course, when we read Yosano Akiko, we talked about Japanese imperialism in continental Asia. Now, what Langston Hughes is referring to here is the very special situation in Shanghai. So Shanghai, of course, is a big port city at the mouth of the Yangtze River. And in the wake of the First Opium War, 1842, a foreign settlement is set up on the lands north of the original Chinese city that was there before. And this international settlement gradually develops into an Anglo-American international settlement and a French concession. And these are semi-colonial or largely self-governed territories. They're essentially, almost a colony within the city. Now, consisting first of mostly British merchants, they were the first to arrive. It soon also attracted other nationals, French, right? There was a French concession, Americans, Japanese, Germans, and they all enjoyed the same extraterritorial rights due to those unequal treaties. We talked about those before. Those treaties that were forced upon the Chinese by those colonial powers. Now, due to a number of socioeconomic and political factors we don't really have time to go into, Shanghai quickly develops into one of China's biggest and most important cities in the 20th century. The image here on the bottom, on the left, is from 1860. You already see a few Western-style buildings that were built by British merchants, and here, of course, in the river, you have, Chinese boats, but you also already have Western vessels. Now, the city really grew very rapidly. So here you have a map from 1870. Here you see the old Chinese city, the walled city. And here you have that new English concession, and you have an American concession here. Here, this round thing, can anybody guess what that is? Yes, that's the horse racing track that the British built. And here you have a map from 1908, and you can see that the city already has grown considerably, right? So this again is the old Chinese city. Here's horse racing track. This is in a north-south direction. This is a different alignment on this map, but we are essentially looking at the same thing, right? And again, we have here the English concession, we have the American concession, and then here we have what later became the French concession. Here we have another map from 1932. So again, you can see that the city has grown considerably. The English and the American settlements have essentially become the international settlement, and here we have the French concession. And here on the right, we have advertisements for Western-style hotels. And the fact that this map is printed in English, of course, shows you that this map made for Westerners, right, visiting the city or living in the city. Now, while these foreign concessions were a constant reminder of Western imperialism in China, to the Chinese, of course, they also provided the city with many modern amenities, such as movie theaters, department stores, dance halls, and nightclubs. You know, Shanghai was really the most modern metropolis in Asia at the time. Maybe, Tokyo was pretty modern too, but this large Western contingent, right, this colonial presence also led to a rapid modernization, industrialization of the city. In addition, there were two universities that had been established by foreigners. There was the Protestant English language St. John's University in the international settlement, and there was the Catholic Université l'Aurore, that was a French-speaking university in the French concession. Now, while these were mostly for the sons and daughters of the foreigners living in Shanghai at the time, Chinese also could and increasingly did attend these two universities. And what's interesting is that Chinese intellectuals who attended them would often develop either an Anglophone or a Francophone tendency, right? If you went to St. John's University, you spoke English and you were interested in the Anglo-American world. With Université l'Aurore, you'd be probably more drawn to French literature and French culture, etc. We already talked about the fact that Paul Morand's fiction was very popular among a certain group of Chinese modernist writers, some of whom incidentally had attended this Université l'Aurore. And this is of course similar to the way the Sino-Japanese cultural exchange had flourished even after the first Sino-Japanese War of 1904-1905. You remember that despite all those political troubles that were brewing in the 20s and 30s, there really was a very close cultural contact and actual mutual respect, at least amongst intellectuals. We had briefly talked about the fact that many Chinese writers, intellectuals, politicians went to study abroad in Japan, even in the 20s and 1930s, and many espoused Japanese fashion, style, Japanese literature. There were certain philosophers who espoused this Pan-Asianism. We had briefly talked about that. That was sort of an idea of uniting Asians to liberate Asia from European colonialism. There were Japanese writers like Tanizaki Junshiro who traveled to Shanghai in 1921, met with a lot of Chinese intellectuals, many of whom had studied in Japan. And if you're interested in that travelogue, remember I had posted that under optional readings in the module on Yosano Akiko. And we had also mentioned Uchiyama Kanzo, a Japanese who had opened a bookstore and salon in Shanghai. That was very important in that it was a meeting place for Chinese and Japanese intellectuals. Now, all of this really underlines the fact that Shanghai, even though it was to some degree a product of Western imperialism and colonialism, was a very, very, very cosmopolitan and in many ways liberal and open city, which makes it really interesting in terms of literature and culture, and why it also fits into our class. Now, among the Anglophone writers in Shanghai, Chinese writers who sort of developed a strong interest in Anglo-American culture, the most important, and one I want you all to remember, is Lin Yutang. Lin Yutang is somebody who was really, really, really well known in America in the post-war period in the 50s and 60s and 70s, because he wrote a lot of books about China in English, and he was really, very well known in America. So Lin Yutang was originally educated at Shanghai's St. John's University. He also went to Harvard for a while and then obtained a doctorate in Germany at Leipzig University, right? You remember that when we talked about Moriogai. And he became one of the most important cultural mediators between China and the West. Now, Shanghai in the late 20s and early 30s had grown into China's foremost metropolis. It was not only the country's industrial and commercial center, but more important for this class, it was also its publishing hub and a city known for its cosmopolitan culture. So Lin Yutang became active as a bilingual critic in Shanghai and also a very successful editor of several literary and current affairs journals. He made a lot of money from them, and these journals frequently carried works by China's foremost modern writers. They all loved to publish in Lin Yutang's journals because he paid them a lot. Now, these journals also carried translations of Western literature and criticism, international news, reports about cultural trends. On the right here, you have a journal in which Lin Yutang was actually heavily involved called the China Critic. This was actually published in English, both to people reading English in Shanghai, foreigners, but also Chinese people who just wanted to read stuff in English. He also had a lot of Chinese language journals. I say a word or two about that in a minute. Lin Yutang also set up a literary group called the Analects Group, the Lun Yu Pai, a loose circle of like-minded liberal and cosmopolitan intellectuals that had a profound impact on China's literary culture at the time, and of which Xu Xu, the writer whom we're going to discuss this week, became a member of. Now, here are just a couple of books if you need some good reading for the summer. This is actually one of the novels that Lin Yutang wrote called Chinatown Family. It's about a Chinese family in New York in the 1920s. We have another work here by an American writer who spent a lot of time in Shanghai called Emily Han. She wrote for The New Yorker, published in 1944, China to Me. I had actually thought about assigning passages from this work for our class, but then decided against it. But I can warmly recommend it if you want to learn a little bit more about the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Shanghai in the 1930s. There was a lot of interest in Shanghai in the West at the time. It really loomed large in people's imagination, so even Hollywood was interested in it. There's a movie with Marlene Dietrich called Shanghai Express, another one called Shanghai Gesture, 1941. A lot of these movies are not actually filmed in Shanghai, they're filmed in studios in Hollywood. They're terribly stereotypical, they're exoticizing. Sometimes Chinese characters are played by Americans, right? There's this concept of yellow face. But I think it still shows you just how much interest there was in Shanghai and what a prominent position Shanghai sort of occupied in the public opinion globally. Now, another really interesting aspect of life in Shanghai in the 1920s and 30s, and one that is very relevant to the story that we're reading this week, is that among the many foreigners living in Shanghai in the 1930s, Jews formed a sizable contingent. And these Jews came from different countries. So the earliest of these were Sephardic Jews who had come with the British following the Opium Wars, and actually they had largely come from India. David Sassoon was a very prominent member of the Jewish community in Bombay. He ran a firm dealing mainly in cotton, tea, and opium and silk in Bombay, and then opens a branch in Shanghai in 1844, which was then continued by his heirs. Victor Sassoon was one of them, a very prominent member. Here you have a picture of him at the Shanghai race course with one of his horses. The Kaduri family and the Hardoon family all built large business and real estate empires in Shanghai. Now, in the 1920s, an increasing number of Russian Jews who had fled their homeland following the October Revolution. You remember we talked about that when we read Langston Hughes, right, and the Civil War. So they came to Shanghai, to the foreign concession in Shanghai. And finally, in the wake of Hitler's rise in Germany in the 1930s and the ensuing systematic persecution of Jews in Germany and the territories that eventually fell under German control, Shanghai saw an influx of some 18,000 Jewish refugees from Central Europe. So you see here on the left we have a Jewish newspaper called the Shanghai Jewish Chronicle that published both in German and in English to cater to that large group of Jewish refugees and Jewish citizens who already lived in Shanghai. Now, if you want to learn more about that really interesting history of the Jews in Shanghai, I posted a link on the PowerPoint. Now, we quickly need to recap what's happening with the Japanese. So you remember that the South Manchurian Railway Company and the Kanto Army are really pushing into Manchuria. Manchukuo, that puppet state, is established. And that is really only the beginning of the invasion of China proper. There already is an incident, a military incident called the Shanghai Incident in 1932, where parts of Shanghai are bombed. Shanghai becomes a demilitarized zone. But the foreigners who are there, the British and the French, they don't really want a war because it would damage their business interests, right? So there is really an appeasement policy. And there is a photo here on the bottom, which is really quite terrible, I find. It's foreigners in the international settlement standing on a high building and sort of looking with binoculars into the Chinese parts of the cities that were bombed by the Japanese, right? So it's sort of a kind of battlefield tourism that we see here. But then war really becomes a reality, right? The Japanese invasion of China proper. In 1937, battles break out in Shanghai. This culminates in the infamous rape of Nanjing. And what happens is that all of Shanghai is pretty much occupied by the Japanese, except for the international settlement, right? That Anglo-American and French settlement, which becomes known as the Solitary Island or Gudao. Now, however, following Pearl Harbor, right, when Japan essentially enters into war with America and America's allies in 1941, even that foreign settlement is occupied. So all of Shanghai is then occupied by the Japanese. And these foreign concessions are not returned to China until the end of World War II. So the colonial period in China proper then ends only with the defeat of Japan. Now, one more word about the Jews of Shanghai. You all recognize this ship, right? Yeah, it's that ship from the opening slides of our course lectures, right? And this is the SS Conteverde, the steamship Conteverde of the Italian Lloyd Triestino line that ran a regular service between Italy and Shanghai. Now, many Jews escaping Europe in the 1930s, right, after the Nazis had come to power in Germany, came to Shanghai aboard Italian liners. And that was so because Italy, of course, was an Axis partner of Nazi Germany. So if these Jews could get to Italy and could purchase a steamer ticket for Shanghai, they could get to Shanghai. And the reason so many of them tried to get to Shanghai was because Shanghai was one of the few cities, or I should say the international settlement, that did not require a visa for arriving visitors. So if you arrived there, you could stay. And that was because the international settlement was not actually a colony that belonged to one country. It was rather a sort of self-administered foreign territory, extraterritorial territory within Shanghai. And that is how and why a few thousand European Jews were able to escape to Shanghai and actually survive the war and the Holocaust in Shanghai. And this is where we will pick up in the second course lecture, so I will see you shortly.